The simulator spat Cadet, writhin out like a bad taste. One moment the Velasee was locked inside the cockpit cradle, his four-fingered hands wrapped around the dual yoke, his mandible plates clenched with the specific tension of a species that had evolved to bite through pressure seals. The next moment the emergency dump protocol fired, the cradle inverted, and Within was on the deck plating in a heap of tangled restraint webbing, his flight suit streaked with the yellow coolant that meant the thermal failsafe had tripped, which meant he had redlined the engine model, which meant he was done. Again. Commander C.L. Vasic did not look up from her datapad. She was standing 4 meters from the simulator bank, boots planted on the worn section of deck where the non-skid coating had been scuffed away by years of pacing. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing. She had brown hair pulled back in a knot that had loosened over the past 11 hours of continuous instruction, and the sleeves of her flight suit were rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms that were, by any galactic standard, unremarkable. No dermal plating. No subdermal armor mesh. No chromatophore fields or radiation-hardened skin. Just the pale, slightly freckled integument of a mammal from a mid-range temperate world that most species in the coalition still classified as a biological curiosity. Her eyes were on the datapad. Her voice carried the same flat, unhurried cadence it had carried since the first simulator rotation at 400. Pitch authority lost at Vector 773. Yaw compensation 2 full seconds late. Throttle input during the stall was forward instead of idle back. You fed the engine into its own turbulence wake and the power plant ate itself. She paused. The pause was not for emphasis. It was because she was reading the next line of telemetry. Ejection loss. Time of flight, 41 seconds. Within untangled himself from the webbing and stood. His mandible plates were clicking the involuntary Velasee stress response that every xenopsychology textbook described as analogous to a human's jaw clench, except louder and visible, and impossible to suppress without pharmaceutical intervention. He was large, broad-shouldered, thick-limbed, built along the dense skeletal architecture that had made the Velasee the Coalition's default assumption for heavy infantry for 6 generations. His species did not, as a biological matter, tremble. But the muscles along his forelimbs were doing something very close to it. "Commander," he said. His voice had the careful, over-controlled quality of someone who was performing composure rather than experiencing it. The stall parameters in this simulation are outside the published flight envelope for the Kestrel 9 airframe. The turbulence model is correct. Within stopped. "The turbulence model is correct," Vasic said. She still had not looked up. "The published flight envelope is the manufacturer's liability boundary. It is the line below which the Kestrel 9 will not kill a pilot who does everything by the manual. It is not the line below which the Kestrel 9 stops flying." Now she looked up. Her eyes were brown. They carried no heat, no anger, no frustration. They carried the same thing they had carried for 11 hours, a steady, undisturbed patience that was worse than any of those alternatives, because it suggested she had already accounted for this exact failure and was simply waiting for the next attempt. The simulation is the aircraft. The aircraft does not lie. You lied to yourself about what you could handle, and the aircraft showed you the truth. Again. Within's mandibles clicked twice more. He looked at the simulator cradle. The coolant was still dripping from the overhead vents, pooling on the seat in a yellow film that the maintenance drone was already moving to clean. "I've run this approach 14 times, he said. 15, Vasic said. "The first one doesn't count. You stalled before you reached the approach vector." "That was taxiing, not flying." Someone in the observation gallery exhaled. It was a small sound, the kind of sound that escapes before discipline can catch it. Vasic's eyes did not move toward it. She had heard it. She had catalogued it. She had decided it was not worth her attention. The gallery held 19 cadets. They were arranged along the curved transparasteel wall that separated the simulator bay from the observation tier. seated on the narrow metal benches that had been designed, with what felt like deliberate hostility, to be exactly uncomfortable enough to prevent sleep, without being uncomfortable enough to constitute a formal complaint. 19 cadets from 11 species, all enrolled in the Vethara Fleet Academy's Advanced Flight Qualification course, all watching Cadet Rithin fail his 15th consecutive attempt at the Vasic corridor. That was what they called it, not officially. The official designation was Approach Pattern 7 Kestrel Modified, a high-angle atmospheric insertion through a narrow canyon with variable crosswinds, unpredictable thermal columns, and a landing zone the size of a fleet shuttle's cargo bay. The Academy's curriculum listed it as an elective module. Vasic had made it mandatory. And then she had made it the gate. Every cadet in advanced flight qualification had to pass the corridor. Pass meant a clean insertion, a stable approach, and a controlled landing with all systems nominal. Fail meant ejection, crash, or engine loss. There was no partial credit. There was no curve. There was no accommodation for species-specific reaction time differentials, visual processing bandwidth, or G-tolerance thresholds, all of which were standard adjustments in every other flight course the Academy offered. Vasic's course did not offer them. Vasic's course offered the corridor, and the corridor offered two outcomes. You landed or you didn't. Cadet Shane Torellis, seated at the far end of the gallery bench, watched Rithin climb back into the simulator cradle for the 16th time and felt something shift in her thoracic cavity that her species did not have a precise word for. Shane was Keith Rossi. Tall, narrow-framed, with the elongated limbs and secondary eyelids that marked her species as low-gravity adapted. Her skin had the faint blue-gray undertone of a Keith Rossi raised on a station world, and her hands, four-fingered, double-jointed, evolved for the kind of fine motor manipulation that made her species disproportionately represented in surgical and engineering fields, were folded in her lap with a stillness that was not calm. It was the specific stillness of someone who had calculated the odds of succeeding at the task ahead, and arrived at a number that made movement feel premature. She had failed the corridor 9 times. 9 attempts across 3 days, each one slightly different. Each one ending the same way. The simulator's emergency dump, the yellow coolant, the deck plating, and Vasic's voice reading the telemetry with the same flat precision she used for every cadet, every failure, every species. Again. That word. Shane had heard Vasic say it to Rithin 6 times today. She had heard her say it to Cadet Murren, a Druvan with compound eyes and the fastest documented visual processing speed in the cohort. 4 times yesterday before Murren's mandibles started clicking so hard that the medical monitor flagged a stress fracture risk, and Vasic had grounded her for 12 hours of mandatory rest. She had heard her say it to Cadet Paul Veronese, a Tessevri whose species could perceive electromagnetic gradients with their skin, giving them a spatial awareness that was, in theory, perfect for atmospheric flight, and Paul had crashed 11 times, and the 12th time he had sat in the ejected cradle and simply not stood up for 4 minutes, his chromatophore field cycling through colors that Shane's Keith Rossi visual range could not fully resolve, but that she understood, from her xenobiology training, corresponded to something between humiliation and grief. Again. Vasic said it without anger, without contempt, without disappointment. That was the part that made it worse. Disappointment would have meant she expected something from them. Anger would have meant they had provoked her. Contempt would have meant she had judged them and found them wanting. But Vasic's, again, carried none of those things. It carried only the calm, unhurried assumption that the task was possible, that the cadet was capable, and that the only variable between this attempt and a successful one was repetition. It was the voice of someone who had done the math on failure and decided it was a resource, not a verdict. It was, Shane thought, the most alien sound she had ever heard from a human. The 16th attempt lasted 53 seconds. Rithin made it past the approach vector this time, a genuine improvement. though Vasic did not acknowledge it, and held the yoke steady through the first crosswind shear. His massive Veloci frame braced against the G-forces that the simulator's motion platform reproduced with clinical fidelity. For a moment, watching the telemetry feed on the gallery's overhead display, Shane felt the specific Keith Rossi response that translated roughly as anticipatory alignment. Her secondary eyelids half closed, her breathing slowed, and her spatial mapping cortex began tracking Rithin's trajectory with the unconscious precision of a species that had navigated asteroid fields by hand for 11 generations. He was going to make the second gate. He didn't. The thermal column hit at Vector 781, a rising wall of superheated air that the simulation modeled as a 600-meter thermal chimney erupting from the canyon floor. Rithin's reaction was textbook. He cut throttle, banked left, and tried to ride the column's edge. But the Kestrel 9 airframe was not designed for the maneuver he was attempting, or rather, it was designed for it, but only if the pilot committed to the bank angle fully, accepting the momentary loss of visual contact with the landing zone, trusting the aircraft's inertial guidance to hold the approach line, while the pilot's eyes were pointed at nothing but canyon wall and sky. Rithin did not commit. He pulled back. The half-bank bled airspeed without gaining altitude, and the thermal column caught the port wing and flipped the airframe like a leaf. The simulator registered catastrophic structural failure at 49 seconds. The emergency dump fired at 53. Rithin hit the deck plating. The coolant rained down. The maintenance drone moved in. "You hesitated at the bank," Vasic said. Her voice had not changed. "You saw the canyon wall and you flinched. The aircraft needed commitment. You gave it caution. Caution killed you. Again." Rithin stood. His mandibles had stopped clicking. That was not a good sign. In Veloci stress physiology, the cessation of involuntary clicking meant the autonomic nervous system had shifted from acute stress to resignation, the body deciding that the threat was no longer survivable and redirecting metabolic resources away from fight or flight toward conservation. Rithin was not in physical danger, but his body did not know that. His body knew only that he had failed 16 times, that the authority figure had not relented, and that the pattern showed no sign of ending. "Commander," he said, his voice was very quiet, "permission to request a reassessment of my flight qualification track." The gallery went still. Reassessment was the word. Everyone knew what it meant. It meant withdrawal. It meant stepping down from advanced flight qualification and accepting a standard track assignment: transport piloting, shuttle operations, cargo routing, safe flying. The kind of flying that kept you alive and kept you employed and kept you exactly where the coalition's statistical models predicted your species would end up. Vasic set her datapad down. She looked at Rithin for a long moment. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not shift. But something in the quality of her attention sharpened, the way a lens sharpens when it finds its focal distance, and Shane felt the entire observation gallery lean forward by a fraction of a degree that no one would have admitted to. "Granted," Vasic said. One word, no argument, no speech about potential. No attempt to talk him out of it. She picked up her datapad, made a notation, and looked at the gallery. "Cadet Torellis, you're next." Shane's hands unlocked from her lap. She stood. Her legs were steady. The Keith Rossi skeletal system did not permit the kind of visible trembling that mammals exhibited under stress, but the muscles along her ribcage were cycling through a contraction pattern that her species' medical literature described as pre-performance anxiety. It was a response originally evolved for vacuum exposure. Her body was preparing itself for the possibility of sudden decompression. She was preparing herself for the corridor. Before she could move, a sound from the gallery made her pause. A Tessevry cadet Paul Veronese, 3 seats down, had shifted in his seat, and the motion had triggered a chromatophore cascade across his left forearm that the cadets nearest to him read immediately. It was fear pattern. Not the sharp, bright fear of acute danger. The slow, spreading fear of a problem that could not be outrun because it was ahead of you, not behind you. Paul's species communicated emotional states through involuntary color shifts, the way Velocity communicated stress through mandible clicking, automatically, visibly, and with no capacity to suppress it in the moment that mattered. The cadets on either side of Paul looked away, not out of disrespect, out of the same instinct that makes a person avert their eyes from someone else's wound. They understood, each through their own species' emotional architecture, what the color meant. They understood it because they were all carrying some version of it. The corridor was ahead of all of them. Shane walked down the gallery steps, across the simulator bay floor, past Rithin, who was standing by the exit hatch with his kit bag already in his hand, his mandibles locked shut, his eyes fixed on a point 6 inches in front of his own feet, and climbed into the cradle. The restraint webbing settled around her narrow frame. The yoke was too wide for her hands. It had been designed for Velocity grip architecture, and her Keith Rossi fingers had to stretch to reach the secondary control inputs. The cockpit smelled like coolant and ozone and the faint chemical signature of Rithin's stress pheromones, which Shane's chemoreceptors registered as a sharp, acrid note that her limbic system interpreted as wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just the wrong that comes before loss. "Whenever you're ready," Vasic said. Shane pressed the activation contact. The canopy sealed. The display field bloomed with the Kestrel 9 heads-up interface, altitude, airspeed, vector, throttle position, engine temperature, structural load, and beyond the display, rendered with the simulator's unsettling fidelity, the mouth of the canyon opened. It was beautiful. The simulation modeled a real canyon on Tesvar 7, a gas giant moon with a thick nitrogen atmosphere and surface winds that exceeded 200 kilometers per hour at the canyon rim. The walls were red-brown, striated with mineral deposits that caught the light of the system's orange dwarf star and turned the canyon into a corridor of amber and rust. The thermal columns were visible as heat shimmer pillars rising from vents in the canyon floor, bending the light, warping the visual field, turning the approach vector into something that looked less like a flight path and more like a hallucination. Shane took the yoke, she advanced the throttle. The simulated Kestrel 9 dropped into the canyon mouth at a 30-degree angle, and the crosswind hit immediately a lateral shear that tried to push the starboard wing into the canyon wall. Shane corrected. Her hands were fast. Keith Rossi fine motor response was measured in fractions of a millisecond, and her corrections were precise enough that the telemetry feed showed a deviation of less than 2 degrees from the optimal approach line. She reached the first gate, passed it. The canyon narrowed. The thermal columns grew denser. The crosswind shifted from lateral to quartering, requiring a constant, micro-adjusted crab angle that ate into her concentration reserves like acid into metal. Second gate passed. Shane's secondary eyelids were fully closed now, a reflexive response that reduced her visual input to the narrow spectrum band her species used for high-precision depth perception. The canyon walls were close, very close. The Kestrel 9 wingtips had less than 30 meters of clearance on each side, and the thermal updrafts were punching the airframe with irregular jolts that the simulator translated into physical impacts through the motion platform, each one jarring her hands on the yoke, testing whether her correction speed could keep up with the chaos. Third gate. The landing zone appeared on the heads-up display, a flat shelf of rock at the canyon's deepest point, barely visible through the heat shimmer, surrounded on 3 sides by vertical walls, and on the 4th by a thermal vent that produced a continuous column of rising air hot enough to melt the Kestrel 9 sensor housing if the approach angle brought the aircraft within 50 meters of it. Shane lined up, Her hands were moving in the precise, mechanical rhythm that Keith Rossi pilots were known for, the rhythm that had made her species the most represented group in the Academy's flight program for 9 consecutive enrollment cycles. She knew the approach. She had studied the telemetry from every failed attempt, her own and others. She had mapped the thermal column's behavior pattern, identified the 2-second window where the updraft weakened enough to allow a clean final turn, and calculated the exact throttle setting that would bring the Kestrel 9 to the shelf with enough airspeed to maintain control authority, but not enough to overshoot the landing zone. She had done everything right. The thermal column shifted. Not by much, not by any amount that the approach model predicted. The simulation introduced a variable, a lateral thermal gust from a secondary vent that the published canyon survey did not include, because the survey had been conducted during the Moon's dry season, and the vent was seasonal, and Vasic's simulation was set to wet season, and nobody had asked, and nobody had checked, because nobody had thought to question whether the woman who designed the corridor had built it with hidden teeth. The gust hit the port wing. Shane's correction was perfect mechanically, kinetically, aerodynamically perfect. She compensated for the roll, adjusted the crab angle, realigned the approach vector. But the correction cost her 2 seconds of time and 14 meters of altitude, and the landing zone was now below her optimal glide path, which meant she needed to lose altitude without losing airspeed, which meant she needed to dive, and diving in a canyon with 30 meters of wingtip clearance and a thermal column rising from the floor was not a textbook maneuver. It was not even in the textbook. Shane dove. She committed to the angle, watched the canyon floor rush upward in the display, felt the motion platform reproduce the G-forces with the cold precision of a machine that did not care whether the pilot's Keith Rossi physiology was rated for this load or not. She held the yoke. She held the throttle. She held the approach line with hands that were doing exactly what 11 generations of low-gravity evolution had designed them to do. And then the floor fell away. The thermal vent directly below the landing shelf erupted a full-cycle thermal pulse that the simulation had been building toward for the entire approach, a column of superheated air that hit the Kestrel 9 undercarriage like a fist and through the airframe straight up, through the approach line, past the abort ceiling, into the turbulent shear layer where the canyon's internal winds met the upper atmospheric current and produced a rotational force that no airframe could survive. The simulator dumped, the cradle inverted. Shane hit the deck plating, the coolant rained down. She lay on the deck for 3 seconds. Not because she was hurt, because she needed those 3 seconds to complete the autonomic reset cycle that her species required after a sudden deceleration event, the cascade of neurological and cardiovascular adjustments that returned a Keith Rossi body from emergency mode to baseline. It was not voluntary. It was not a choice. It was biology. She stood. Thermal pulse at the final approach, Vasic said. She was reading the telemetry. Your correction on the lateral gust was clean. Your dive commitment was correct, but you flew the approach on the assumption that the canyon was a static environment. It isn't. The vent cycles. The cycle is predictable. You didn't account for it because you were solving the problem in front of you instead of the problem underneath it. She looked up. Again. Shane climbed back into the cradle. She failed. Again. The next 3 hours produced 7 more attempts. Each one lasted longer than the last. Each one ended the same way: the simulator dump, the coolant, the deck plating, the 3-second autonomic reset, and Vasic's voice, reading the telemetry, identifying the failure point with the same clinical precision, and closing with the same word. Again, again, again. On the 11th attempt, Shane tried a different entry angle, shallower, trading speed for stability, giving herself more time to read the crosswind pattern before committing to the first gate. The approach lasted 67 seconds, the longest of any attempt by any cadet that day. She made it past the second gate with a lateral deviation of 1 degree. She was flying better than she had ever flown. The third gate killed her, not because of the crosswind, because the shallower entry angle had put her 8 seconds behind the thermal cycle she did not yet know existed, and the pulse caught her at peak altitude with nowhere to climb and no airspeed to trade for a roll correction. The Kestrel 9 tumbled. The dump fired. Better approach geometry, Vasic said. Worse timing. You traded one variable for another without knowing what you were trading into. She paused. The canyon has more than one system. You're only flying against one of them. Again. Shane filed the comment. She did not understand it, not yet. But she filed it the way her Keith Rossi spatial mapping cortex filed navigational anomalies, as a data point that did not fit the current model, which meant the current model was incomplete. On the 12th attempt, something changed, not in the simulator, in Shane. The approach was the same: the canyon, the crosswinds, the thermal columns, the gates, but her hands were doing something different. They were not faster. They were not more precise. They were quieter. The microcorrections that had been sharp, definitive inputs on attempts 1 through 11 had become smaller, softer, more continuous, less like a pilot fighting the aircraft, and more like a conversation between two systems that were beginning to understand each other's language. She made it past the third gate for the first time. The landing shelf was visible. The thermal vent was building toward its next pulse. Shane could feel it in the telemetry, a rising temperature gradient on the lower hull sensors, a faint vibration in the airframe that the motion platform translated as a deep, subsonic hum. She adjusted her descent angle, steepened it, accepted the additional G-load because the math told her that arriving 2 seconds earlier would put her on the shelf before the pulse peaked. The math was wrong. The pulse peaked 3 seconds early. The thermal column caught the Kestrel 9 at 60 meters and turned it sideways. The dump fired. The coolant came down. Closer, Vasic said. It was the first time she had used a word other than again, or a telemetry reading to assess an attempt. Shane, standing on the deck plating with coolant dripping from the ridge of cartilage above her secondary eyelids, felt the word land in a place she had not expected, not as encouragement, as data. Vasic was telling her that the distance between failure and success had changed. Again, Vasic said. The 13th attempt lasted 91 seconds. Shane made it past the third gate again, past the thermal pulse by climbing early and riding its edge, a technique that cost her altitude but kept the airframe intact. She descended toward the shelf. The landing zone was there, visible and real and close enough that the proximity alarm began its pre-approach chime. But the altitude she had lost riding the thermal pulse's edge had pushed her below the optimal glide path by 22 meters, and the only way to recover was to add throttle. And adding throttle in a canyon with 30 meters of wingtip clearance produced a speed-dependent oscillation in the Kestrel 9 control surfaces that the published manual described as manageable, and that the simulator described, with its usual brutal honesty, as a control loss precursor. Shane managed the oscillation for 4 seconds, then the oscillation managed her. The dump fired, coolant, deck plating, 3-second reset. You're solving the wrong problem, Vasic said. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The telemetry was on the display. The 13 approaches were stacked like sediment layers in a core sample, and somewhere in those layers was the answer to a question Shane had not yet learned to ask. The gallery watched. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, Vasic did something that Shane would remember long after the telemetry data and the coolant stains had faded from memory. Between Shane's 11th and 12th attempts, while the maintenance drone cleaned the cradle and Shane stood on the deck plating running her hands over the ridge of cartilage above her secondary eyelids to clear the coolant residue, Vasic had crossed the simulator bay to the equipment station in the corner, poured a cup of the black human stimulant from the thermal dispenser, and walked back to her position. The entire trip took 14 seconds. In those 14 seconds, Shane watched the human's gait, her posture, the way she held the cup. There was no stiffness, No shift in weight to favor a fatigued leg. No micro-adjustment of posture that would have indicated spinal compression from standing on hard decking for 11 consecutive hours. Vasic moved the way she had moved at 400, the same stride length, the same arm swing, the same baseline economy of motion. She was not performing endurance. She was not demonstrating it for the gallery's benefit. She was simply operating within the parameters of a species whose evolutionary architecture had been designed for exactly this. Sustained effort over a timeline that made other species' autonomic systems shut down. Some of the cadets had stopped watching the simulator display and were watching Vasic instead, studying her the way they might study a species they had never encountered in the field. Shane caught fragments of whispered conversation during the intervals between attempts, Murren's compound eyes clicking through focal patterns, as she discussed reaction time margins with Paul Veronese, whose chromatophore fields were cycling through a muted olive that Shane had learned to read as troubled fascination. "She doesn't get tired," Paul said. He was not talking about Shane, he was talking about Vasic. "I watched her for 14 hours yesterday. She drank 2 cups of that black liquid, the stimulant, and she ate a compressed ration bar at hour 8. That was it. She doesn't shift her weight. She doesn't look at the chronometer. She doesn't give any indication that time is passing." "Humans have an endurance metabolism," Murren said. Her mandibles were clicking softly, not stress, but the rhythmic pattern that Druven used for analytical processing. Persistence, predator ancestry. They can sustain moderate cognitive and physical output for periods that most species in the coalition cannot match without pharmaceutical support. "That's the body," Paul said. "I'm not talking about the body. I'm talking about the patience. How does a species develop the capacity to watch someone fail 30 times and not change the test?" Murren's mandibles paused. "Perhaps the test is not what we think it is." Shane did not hear this conversation. She was in the cradle, on her 14th attempt, watching the canyon open beneath her for the 14th time, feeling the crosswind hit for the 14th time, making the corrections she had made 13 times before, and looking for the thing she had missed 13 times before. The thermal vent cycle. Vasic had told her it was predictable. That meant it had a pattern. That meant the pattern was in the telemetry data that the simulator recorded after every run. That meant every failed attempt was not just a failure, it was a data point. And if Shane had been treating her failures as endings instead of measurements, she had been wasting the most valuable resource the corridor offered. She made a decision. When the simulator dumped her for the 14th time and she completed her 3-second reset and stood on the deck plating with coolant dripping from her flight suit, she did not immediately climb back into the cradle. She looked at Vasic. "Commander, I request access to the cumulative telemetry logs from my previous 13 attempts." Vasic looked up from her datapad. For the first time in what felt like days, something changed in her expression. It was subtle, a fractional shift in the musculature around her eyes, a micro-adjustment that Shane's Keith Rossi facial recognition processing flagged as a tension increase without threat assessment. It was, Shane realized, the closest thing to approval she had seen on the human's face since the course began. "Granted," Vasic said. She tapped her datapad, and the telemetry appeared on the gallery's overhead display, 13 approach runs laid over each other like geological strata, each one a slightly different color, each one showing the altitude, airspeed, vector, and thermal environment readings for the full duration of the flight. Shane studied it. The gallery went quiet, not the forced quiet of military decorum, but the genuine quiet of people watching someone think. The thermal vent cycle was there. It was obvious once you had 13 data points to map it. The vent pulsed every 94 seconds, with a build-up phase of 12 seconds and a peak discharge phase of 6 seconds. The pulse strength varied by approximately 11% between cycles, but the timing was consistent within a 2-second margin. The canyon's published survey had not recorded this, because the survey pilots had never spent enough continuous time in the canyon to observe more than 2 cycles, and 2 cycles was not enough data to establish a pattern. Vasek's corridor required a minimum approach time of 80 seconds at optimal speed. That meant every approach would encounter at least 1 thermal pulse. The question was not whether the pulse would come. The question was where in the approach the pilot chose to be when it arrived. Shane looked at the stacked telemetry. She ran the math. Her Keith Rossi spatial mapping cortex did what 11 generations of evolution had designed it to do. It took a field of variables and found the line through them. "The approach needs to be slower," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Not faster. I've been trying to outrun the cycle. The cycle is longer than the approach window. I can't outrun it. But if I reduce approach speed by 18% and extend the flight time to 104 seconds, I can time the final descent to arrive at the landing shelf during the vent's quiescent phase, the 12-second window between pulse decay and build-up initiation." She looked at Vasek. Vasek's expression had not changed, but she had set her datapad down. She was standing with her arms at her sides, her weight balanced evenly on both feet, her eyes steady on Shane with the specific quality of attention that Shane had seen only once before in the course, when Vasek had watched a Tessavri cadet named Oren D. Howe execute a clean roll reversal at 300 meters that had made even the simulator technicians lean forward. "Then do it," Vasek said. Shane climbed into the cradle. She sealed the canopy. She pressed the activation contact. The canyon opened. She did not attack it. She entered it the way water enters a channel, yielding to the shape of the space, letting the crosswinds push her, and then correcting with the smallest possible input, conserving airspeed instead of spending it. The gallery displays showed her approach speed dropping 240 knots instead of the 290 that every previous attempt had used. The time to target counter climbed. 80 seconds. 90. 94. The thermal pulse fired. Shane was ready. She was at 400 meters of altitude, well above the pulse's effective ceiling, riding the upper edge of the canyon's wind layer in a shallow banking turn that kept the landing zone in her peripheral vision. The pulse roared beneath her. She could see it on the thermal display, a vertical column of superheated air that turned the canyon floor into a furnace, and she held her altitude, held her bank angle, held her airspeed, and counted. 6 seconds of peak discharge. The column began to decay. The thermal display showed the temperature gradient collapsing, the updraft weakening, the air above the landing shelf settling from violent turbulence to moderate chop to something approaching stability. She pushed the nose down. The dive was controlled, deliberate. She was not trying to outperform the canyon. She was not trying to demonstrate Keith Rossi superiority in fine motor response or spatial processing. She was flying the way Vasek's corridor demanded, not with reflex but with understanding. The crosswind hit at 300 meters. She corrected. The quartering gust hit at 200. She absorbed it, letting the airframe drift 6 meters off the approach line, and then easing it back with a throttle adjustment so subtle that the telemetry display barely registered the input. 100 meters. The landing shelf was visible through the heat shimmer, flat, gray-brown, smaller than it looked in the briefing materials. The thermal vent was quiescent. The air above the shelf was as close to calm as this canyon ever got. 50 meters. Shane's secondary eyelids were closed. Her hands were on the yoke. Her breathing was a rhythm she had not chosen but had earned the specific cadence of a body that was not fighting the environment, not bracing for failure, not preparing for the dump protocol. Just flying. 20 meters. The proximity alarm chimed. The landing gear deployed. 10 meters. The Kestrel 9 shadow crossed the shelf. Contact. The simulator did not dump. The coolant did not rain down. The canopy did not invert. The telemetry display froze on a single readout. Approach complete, all parameters nominal, landing confirmed. The gallery did not cheer. There were species in the observation tier whose biology did not support the vocalization patterns that humans associated with celebration, and there were species that did but whose military training had suppressed the impulse so thoroughly that it would have required deliberate effort to produce. What happened instead was a collective exhalation, 19 bodies releasing tension along 19 different anatomical pathways, producing a sound that was not unified, but was synchronized. The way a room full of different instruments can play the same beat without playing the same note. Shane sat in the cradle. Her hands were still on the yoke. The canopy was still sealed. The simulator's display showed the canyon in the stillness of a completed approach, the walls rising on either side, the thermal vent dormant, the landing shelf beneath the Kestrel 9 landing gear solid and real in hers. She opened the canopy manually. She climbed out. She stood on the deck plating dry this time, no coolant, and looked at Vasek. The human flight instructor was standing in the same position she had occupied for the last 14 hours. Her datapad was at her side. Her face carried the same steady, undisturbed expression it had carried since 400, but her eyes were different, not warmer, not softer, not proud exactly. The word Shane's Keith Rossi emotional lexicon supplied was closer to recognition, the look of someone who had been watching for a specific thing and had finally seen it. "Cadet Torellis," Vasek said, "what did you do differently?" Shane considered the question. It was not rhetorical. Vasek did not ask rhetorical questions. She asked precise questions that required precise answers, and the answer she was looking for was never the mechanical one, never the throttle setting, never the approach speed, never the bank angle. "I stopped trying to beat the corridor," Shane said. "I started trying to understand it." Vasek nodded, one nod small. The kind of motion a human made when a circuit closed inside their cognition, when something they had been waiting for arrived and confirmed what they had already known. "That's the lesson," Vasek said. She did not raise her voice. She did not turn to the gallery. She said it to Shane directly, the way one pilot talks to another. "Every cadet who sits in that cradle tries to beat the corridor with their species' best trait. Velasi use raw strength on the yoke. Druven use processing speed. Tessevry use electromagnetic sensing. Keith Rossi use fine motor precision. And every single one of them crashes because the corridor isn't testing any of those things. It's testing whether you can stop relying on the thing you're best at and start learning the thing you don't know." She looked at the gallery. 19 faces, mandibles, compound eyes, chromatophore fields, gill slits, secondary eyelids, radiation membranes looked back at her. "The Kestrel 9 doesn't care what species you are," Vasek said. "The canyon doesn't care. The thermal vent doesn't care. Physics doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accommodate. It doesn't grade on a curve. The only question it asks is whether you understand the environment you're operating in, and the only way to answer that question is to fail enough times to learn what you're missing." She picked up her datapad. "Cadet Murren, you're next." Murren stood. Her compound eyes were cycling through focal patterns that Shane recognized from long acquaintance, the rapid assessment mode that Druven engaged when they were processing new information against existing models. But there was something else in the pattern now, a rhythm Shane had not seen before. Not hesitation, not fear. The compound eye equivalent of a deep breath before a dive. Murren walked down the gallery steps. She paused at the bottom, where the simulator bay floor was still damp from the cleaning drone's last pass, and looked back at the gallery. At Shane, who was settling back into her bench seat with the specific careful deliberateness of someone whose body was still running on the residual adrenaline of a completed crisis. At Paul Veronese, whose chromatophore fields had shifted from fear pattern to something Shane's xenobiology training classified as active curiosity. At the 17 other cadets who were watching with the focused attention of people who had just seen a locked door open and were recalculating their own chances of getting through it. Then Murren turned, walked across the bay floor and climbed into the cradle. The restraint webbing settled around her drooping frame. Her species' body architecture was denser than a Keith Rossi's, broader through the thorax, with the reinforced exoskeletal plating that made Druven naturally resistant to impact damage, but less flexible in confined spaces. The cockpit, designed for Velocity proportions, was too narrow for her shoulder width. She had to tuck her mandibles against her chest to avoid catching them on the canopy seal. "Commander," Murren said, "request access to cumulative telemetry logs." Something happened to Vasik's face. It was small. It was quick. A human observer might have called it the ghost of a smile, the fractional contraction of muscles around the mouth that humans used to signal private satisfaction, the kind that was not performed for an audience but leaked from the interior. It lasted less than a second. Shane, whose Keith Rossi facial recognition processing operated at a resolution that most species could not match, caught it clearly. "Granted," Vasik said. Murren studied the logs. She asked a question about the wind shear periodicity at Gate 2. Vasik answered it factually, precisely, without volunteering anything beyond what was asked. Murren made a small clicking sound with her mandibles that meant she had integrated the information, and she pressed the activation contact. She crashed, the dump fired, the coolant rained down. Murren stood, completed her species' autonomic reset, a rapid mandible flutter that cleared the stress hormones from her hemolymph, looked at the telemetry. The wind shear at Gate 2 has a secondary oscillation that the primary data doesn't resolve. I need higher resolution sampling on the lateral gust channel. "Granted," Vasik said. Murren climbed back in, crashed again, stood, studied the data, asked another question, climbed back in. The third time, she made it to the final approach. The thermal pulse caught her, but she had mapped its timing from the expanded dataset, and she was already climbing when it fired. She wrote it out. She descended during the quiescent window. She was 20 meters from the shelf when a crosswind gust, one that her compound eyes had seen coming, one that she had pre-calculated a correction for, hit at an angle that differed from her prediction by 3 degrees. 3 degrees. The Kestrel 9 correction authority at that airspeed and that proximity to the canyon wall was rated for 4 degrees. 3 was within tolerance. But Murren's correction was built on her prediction, not on the actual gust, and the 2-degree error propagated through her control inputs like a crack through crystal, each subsequent adjustment slightly off, each slightly off adjustment compounding the next, until the airframe was oscillating in a lateral wobble that the simulator flagged as control loss precursor. She ejected manually, before the dump protocol fired, before the structural failure threshold triggered. She made the decision to eject not because the aircraft was lost, but because she recognized that her control solution was diverging and that continuing would produce a crash instead of a learning opportunity. The cradle inverted. The coolant came down. Murren stood, completed her reset, looked at Vasik. "The correction was wrong because I was predicting instead of responding. I need to integrate real-time gust data into the correction loop instead of pre-calculating against the model." Vasik set her datapad down. That micro-expression crossed her face again, the one that was not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something adjacent to both that Shane was beginning to understand was the highest signal of respect the human's emotional architecture produced. "Again," Vasik said. But the word was different now. Shane heard it from the gallery bench where she sat watching Murren climb back into the cradle, and the word was the same word. It had always been the same syllable, the same flat cadence, the same unhurried delivery. But it was not the same. Because when Vasik had said it to Rithin, it had been an instruction. When she had said it to Shane during the first 9 failures, it had been a challenge. And when she said it now to Murren, who was climbing into the cradle not because she was ordered to, but because she understood what the cradle was offering her, it was something else entirely. It was an invitation. The course ran for 3 more weeks. 22 cadets had entered. By the end of the first week, 6 had requested reassessment and withdrawn. Rithin was the first. A Tessevri named Olin followed 2 days later, his chromatophore fields locked in a flat, colorless gray that his species associated with emotional shutdown. He did not speak to anyone on his way out. 3 more left in a cluster on day 5. A pair of Velisi who had been flight school classmates since their larval stage, and a Druvan, whose medical monitor registered a cortisol analog, so elevated that the academy physician issued a direct order to stop. The 6th was a Keithrasi named Den Sorelli. She had made it past the 3rd gate twice. She had seen the landing shelf. She had come close enough that the proximity alarm had chimed before the thermal pulse threw her into the canyon wall. She stood on the deck plating after her 11th crash, looked at Vasek and said, "I understand what you're asking. I cannot give it." Vasek had regarded her for a long moment. "What do you think I'm asking?" "You are asking me to stop being Keithrasi when I fly." "No," Vasek said. "I am asking you to be more than Keithrasi." She paused. "The difference matters." Den Sorelli considered this. Her secondary eyelids cycled twice a processing rhythm that Shane recognized from her own biology. Then she said, "I request reassessment," and Vasek granted it, and she walked out, and the gallery held 17. By the end of the 2nd week, 2 more had washed out on medical grounds stress-related. Both of them, species whose autonomic systems could not sustain the repetitive failure recovery cycle that the corridor demanded without accumulating neurochemical damage that the Academy's medical staff flagged as unsustainable. A Velisi named Taran, whose mandible plates had developed microfractures from sustained involuntary clicking. A species called the Gelveni, whose name Shane never learned to pronounce correctly, whose entire stress response architecture was built around a single catastrophic hormonal dump designed for predator encounters: 1 burst, 1 escape, then hours of recovery. The corridor asked for dozens of bursts per day. The Gelveni's endocrine system simply could not produce them. 15 remained. Then 14, when a Druvan named Chelis crashed for the 28th time and sat in the ejected cradle and said, very quietly, in the flat tone that Druvan used when they had exhausted their emotional processing capacity, "I do not wish to become the kind of person who can do this." Vasek had looked at her for a long time, longer than she looked at most cadets. And then she had said, "That is the first honest reason anyone has given me for leaving." Granted. 14 remained, and something had changed among them. It started with the telemetry requests. After Shane's breakthrough, every cadet who entered the cradle asked for the cumulative logs before their first attempt. Vasek granted each request without comment, but the change went deeper than data access. The gallery, which had spent the first week watching in isolated silence, each cadet alone with their own approaching failure, had become something else. A collective, not in any formal sense, not by agreement, by proximity and shared experience. They compared telemetry notes during rest intervals. They pointed out patterns the current pilot might have missed. A Velisi named Kor, smaller than Rithin, quieter, with mandible plates that barely clicked even under maximum stress, had begun sketching wind flow diagrams on the gallery's secondary display during other cadets' runs, mapping the crosswind oscillation patterns with the patient, repetitive focus of a species that measured dedication in decades. The Academy's Student Affairs Office sent an inquiry to Vasek during the 2nd week, asking whether the course's attrition rate constituted a pedagogical concern. Shane heard about it through the Academy's gossip network. A Druvan administrative clerk whose compound eyes missed nothing in the corridors had mentioned it to Thesek, who mentioned it to Murin, who mentioned it to the gallery at large with the flat, analytical delivery of someone reporting a weather forecast. Vasek's response to the inquiry, according to the clerk, had been 4 words long. Shane never learned what the 4 words were, but the inquiry was not repeated. Vasek did not adjust the corridor. She did not lower the wind speeds or widen the canyon or extend the landing zone or remove the seasonal thermal vent. She did not offer encouragement. She did not offer sympathy. She did not tell any of them that they were close or that she believed in them or that the corridor was designed to be passable. She offered telemetry data when requested. She answered questions when asked. She said again when they crashed. And one by one, the cadets began to land. Shane had landed on her 15th attempt, the first in the cohort. Murren landed on her 7th attempt after requesting the telemetry logs, the fastest total from the moment a cadet started asking the right questions. The entire gallery knew it, and Murren knew it, and she attributed the speed, in the clipped analytical cadence of driven academic discourse, to the superior data integration capacity of her compound-eye visual processing system. Everyone else in the gallery attributed it to the fact that she had learned to stop using it and start listening to the aircraft. Paul Veronese landed on his 19th attempt. His path to the shelf had been the strangest of all. For the first 14 runs, he had relied on his TESEVRY electromagnetic sensitivity, the skin-level perception of gradient fields that gave his species a spatial awareness no other cadet in the cohort could match. He could feel the canyon's thermal columns as pressure differentials against his forearms. He could sense the crosswind shear before the instruments registered it. And none of it helped, because the Kestrel 9 cockpit was sealed and climate-controlled, and the electromagnetic gradient he was sensing was the simulator's electrical field, not the canyon's atmosphere. On the 15th run, after 4 days of studying the stacked telemetry, Paul had done something no one expected. He had asked Vasic to disable the simulator's climate control and let the thermal environment bleed through the cockpit hull. Vasic had regarded him for 3 seconds, the longest pause Shane had ever seen from her, and said, "The real cockpit has climate control. You would be training yourself to use an input that won't exist in the field." Paul had considered this. His chromatophore fields had cycled through a slow, thoughtful green. "Then I need to learn to fly without the input I'm best at," he said. Vasic's expression had not changed, but she had nodded. And on his 19th attempt, Paul Veronese, flying blind to the electromagnetic gradients his skin screamed for, relying on nothing but the instruments and the telemetry and the understanding he had built from 18 failures, landed the Kestrel 9 on the shelf with a lateral deviation of 0.4 degrees, the most precise touchdown in the cohort's history. His chromatophore fields, when the simulator display showed landing confirmed, cycled through a color that no one in the gallery had a name for, a deep, saturated hue somewhere between ultraviolet and blue, that his species produced only under conditions of extreme emotional significance. He did not explain what it meant. He did not need to. A Druvan cadet named Thesic landed on her 24th attempt. She had the worst reaction time in the cohort, a full 40% deficit compared to Murren, her species mate, and she had compensated by developing a completely different approach to the corridor, one that relied not on speed of correction, but on anticipation of the next disturbance, reading the canyon's patterns so deeply that she was adjusting before the gusts arrived. It was ugly flying. It broke 6 of the Academy's standard piloting doctrines. It was, Vasic said, reading the telemetry after Thesic's successful landing, the most creative flight solution she had seen in 9 years of teaching the course. Thesic sat in the cradle for 45 seconds after landing, her mandibles locked in the pattern that Shane had learned to identify as the Druvan equivalent of weeping. A Velassie named Core, smaller than Rithin, quieter, with mandible plates that barely clicked even under maximum stress, landed on his 30th attempt. 30. 3 weeks of daily failures, daily coolant baths, daily telemetry readings delivered in a flat human voice that never wavered. Core had been the cadet that the rest of the gallery had privately expected to follow Rithin out. He was the least physically imposing Velassie in the cohort. His reaction time, while well within his species' normal range, was measurably slower than Rithin's had been. His first 12 attempts had been among the shortest in the class, the simulator dumping him before he reached the second gate. His Velasy grip architecture fighting the yoke instead of guiding it. His mandibles producing a low, continuous clicking that the medical monitor flagged as chronic but not acute. But Core had not left. He had sat in the gallery between attempts and watched every other cadet fly with a stillness that was not resignation. It was study. He had watched Shane's breakthrough. He had watched Murren's analytical deconstruction of the wind shear oscillation. He had watched Paul's chromatophore epiphany. And on his 20th attempt, something in his approach had changed, not a dramatic shift, not a sudden insight, but a slow, grinding recalibration that happened over the course of 10 consecutive runs, each one a fraction of a percent better than the last, each one surviving 2 or 3 seconds longer, each one getting 8 or 12 meters closer to the shelf. It was not elegant. It was not fast. It was the Velasy version of persistence, which was not the same as a human's persistence. It was heavier, slower, built not on the restless need to try again, but on the species' deep-rooted incapacity to accept that a problem had no solution. On the 30th attempt, Core landed the Kestrel 9 with a descent rate that was technically outside the safe parameters, hard enough that in a real aircraft, the struts would have needed inspection. But the display read landing confirmed, and Core climbed out of the cradle and stood on the dry deck plating and turned to Vasek and said, "I understand now." Vasek looked at him. "What do you understand?" "Why you never changed the test, because the test was never the problem." Vasek nodded, that same small nod, that same closed circuit. By the end of the third week, all 14 remaining cadets had landed the corridor. The last was a small, quiet species called the Rithani, bioluminescent, aquatic adapted, flying on borrowed instincts, and a spatial processing architecture designed for three-dimensional water currents rather than atmospheric turbulence. Cadet Vessin had crashed 37 times. The medical staff had flagged her twice. She had requested additional simulator time on her rest days. Vasek had denied the request, told her to sleep, and been waiting by the simulator cradle when Vessin returned 12 hours later. Vessin's landing was not clean. The touchdown was hard enough that the simulator's structural integrity monitor flagged a gear strut warning. The approach line on the telemetry display looked less like a flight path and more like a fever chart. But the display read landing confirmed, and Vessin sat in the cradle with her bioluminescent markings pulsing in a slow, deep rhythm that Shane's xenobiology training identified as the Rithani state of profound relief, and Vasek said, "Gear strut took 23% over rated load. In a real aircraft, you'd need maintenance before your next flight, but you'd be alive to request it." It was, from Vasek, practically a standing ovation. Vasek conducted no ceremony. She filed no commendations. She did not tell them they had passed. She told them, in the same flat, unhurried voice she had used for every telemetry reading and every, again, that the course was complete and that their qualification records would be updated within 48 hours. They stood in the simulator bay, 14 cadets from 9 species, still wearing flight suits stained with dried coolant, still carrying the specific exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the sustained cognitive labor of learning something they had not known they needed to learn. The simulator cradle sat empty behind them, its restraint webbing hanging loose, its displays dark. Vasek collected her datapad. She rolled her sleeves down. She buttoned the cuffs with the small, precise movements of a mammal whose fine motor control was, Shane now knew, not remarkable by any galactic standard, not Keith Rossi fast, not Druven precise, not Tess everywhere. Just human. Just the hands of a species that had learned to fly by failing 1,000 times in machines that killed them when they got it wrong, and getting into the machines again the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, until the sky stopped being an enemy and became a language they had taught themselves to speak. Shane watched her prepare to leave and realized, with the sudden clarity of a navigation fix locking into place, that she had never once seen Vasek leave the simulator bay before the last cadet of the day had finished. Not once. Not during the 14-hour sessions. Not during the week when 3 cadets washed out in 2 days and the medical staff recommended a 48-hour course suspension. Vasek had been here when the first cadet arrived and here when the last one left. Every day, for 3 weeks, she had consumed coffee and ration bars and nothing else. She had not mentioned fatigue or shift changes or the existence of a world outside the simulator bay. She had simply been present, the way a fixed navigational beacon is present not because it chooses to be, but because its function requires it. Vasek walked toward the exit. She stopped at the hatch and turned back. The corridor was built from a real canyon approach on Tesvar 7, she said. 61 years ago, a coalition strike group attempted the insertion during wet season. They used the published flight envelope. They lost 9 aircraft and 14 pilots in 11 minutes. She paused. The next year, a single human test pilot flew the canyon 43 times. She crashed 39 of them. The 40th she landed. The 41st she landed clean. The 42nd she landed in a crosswind that exceeded the airframe's rated tolerance by 40%. The 43rd she brought a flight recorder and mapped the thermal vent cycle for the first time. She looked at them. 14 faces, 9 species, every one of them carrying the specific exhaustion that comes from spending weeks failing at something that matters, and the specific stillness that comes from having finally succeeded. Shane watched Vasek's eyes move from face to face and recognized what the human was doing. She was not scanning the room. She was not addressing a group. She was looking at each of them individually, the way she had looked at each of them in the cradle one at a time, with the full weight of her attention, as if the act of seeing them was itself a form of respect that her species did not know how to express in words. That pilot's data is what you've been flying. Her mistakes are in your telemetry. Her crashes are your approach model. Everything you learned in that cradle, she learned first in a real cockpit in a real canyon with real physics that would have killed her if she got it wrong. She paused again, and for the first time in 3 weeks, her voice carried something that was not instruction or assessment or clinical observation. It carried weight. The weight of a species that did not excel at any single thing the galaxy measured, and excelled at the one thing the galaxy did not know how to measure. The willingness to fail 39 times and sit down in the cockpit for the 40th. She said again to herself every time she crashed. Nobody told her to. Nobody ordered her to. She wasn't on a course. She wasn't being evaluated. She just got up and she got back in and she said the word and she flew. Vasek looked at Shane, at Murren, at Paul, at Kor, at Thesek, at Vesen, at the 8 others who had stayed. Now you know what the word means. She walked through the hatch and did not look back. The simulator bay was quiet. The maintenance drone had finished its cleaning cycle and was docked in its charging station, its indicator light pulsing a soft blue in the institutional dimness. The cradle sat empty. The displays were dark. The deck plating was dry. Shane stood in the center of the room and felt the specific Keith Rossi neurological state that her species called resonance alignment, the condition in which the spatial mapping cortex, the analytical processing centers, and the emotional integration pathways all synchronized on a single understanding, producing a clarity that was not intellectual and not emotional but both at once. The way a navigation fix is not just a number and not just a direction, but the place where the two become the same thing. She understood. Not the corridor. She had understood the corridor when she landed it. What she understood now was Vasek. The flat voice, the unhurried patience, the data pad and the telemetry and the single word repeated 39 times to a pilot who was not ready, and then once more to a pilot who was. Again was not a command. It was not a punishment. It was not an evaluation. It was a belief, expressed in the only language a human pilot knew how to speak, the language of getting back in the cockpit. Shane looked at the empty cradle. Around her, the other cadets were filing out Murrin with her mandibles clicking in the soft analytical rhythm that meant she was already processing what she had learned. Paul with his chromatophore fields settled into a deep, stable blue that Shane had never seen on him before. Core with his mandible plates locked in the quiet, definitive stillness that Velocity used when they had finished a task they would not need to do again. Thesic paused at the hatch and looked back at the cradle for a long moment, her compound eyes cycling through a focal pattern that Shane's xenobiology training could not classify, and then she turned and left. Vessen's bioluminescent markings pulsed once, a single, slow, deep-water rhythm that her species used as a farewell to places that had changed them. Shane stayed. She thought about a human woman 61 years ago climbing into a real cockpit in a real canyon on a moon so far from Earth that the light from her home star had not yet arrived. Crashing, climbing out, getting back in, crashing again, 39 times, no instructor, no gallery, no one watching, just a woman and a machine and a canyon and a word. Again. Shane's secondary eyelids opened. The simulator bay came into full-spectrum focus, every surface, every shadow, every angle of the institutional light that fell through the observation gallery's transparasteel wall and painted the deck in long, pale rectangles. She turned and walked through the hatch into the corridor beyond, where the Academy's day cycle was beginning and the light was clean, and the air carried nothing she recognized, which meant it carried the future. Which meant it carried the place where the next thing she did not yet know was waiting for her to fail at it enough times to understand.